What's the title of your most recent book, and what's it about?
Tecnocracy Rising. Subtitle: The Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. Transformation is a buzzword today in the global elite circles. That's what's happening to our world. And Tecnocracy Rising is literally about the rise of technocracy, replacement economic system from the 1930s, to sweep across the entire world.
Why did you write the book?
I wrote Tecnocracy Rising because it had to be written. It was a topic that was virtually unknown. The historical movement of technocracy was largely undiscovered in modern times. And yet, when I discovered it had tremendous significance to current affairs, I knew that the story absolutely had to be written. And this was in lieu somewhat of my idea of writing a final book, Trilaterals over Washington, Volume 3, which would have completed a trilogy. But I decided not to do that this story of technocracy was much, much more important than merely describing the actions, the current actions of the Trilateral Commission, bringing things up to date in the last 40 years and so on. And it does all that in addition in the book Tecnocracy Rising. But I do believe that the concept of technocracy in today's modern world is the singular most important concept that people have missed and also that people need to get a hold of.
How would you define freedom?
Freedom. Well, freedom and liberty are closely related topics. And some people would define freedom as just the ability to do whatever the heck you want to do. And I suppose there's merit in that, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else and you don't intrude on another person's rights to freedom as well. But I think in a larger context, freedom in a society has a little bit different concept than a freedom as an individual. We certainly need freedoms as individuals. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence guarantees it to us. But in a societal sense, freedom and liberty have the context of being able to operate together and live in live in close proximity to each other, to monitor the affairs of society in such a way that people have a maximized number of choices on what they can do with their lives, what they want to do with their lives, the right to self-determination as either a family or as an individual or as a group of people, without tromping on the rights of other people and damaging their property, damaging their ability to do what they want to do. And there's limits to that. For instance, if people come into society and want to destroy that society altogether by force, for instance, the recent ISIS attacks down in Texas is a good case in point. Should we allow people like ISIS to exercise free speech in our country if that speech is specifically designed to destroy our country? I think not. I think not. But liberty and freedom are things that are ingrained in the Constitution of our nation. They're ingrained, I believe, in our heritage. We've had lots of close calls over the decades where it looked like it was going to be curtains, yet it wasn't, and we're still here.
What's the most important concept to realize in terms of technocracy for an average reader of your book?
The most important and shocking part of technocracy is that it's not a political system. It was defined as an economic system. It's a big difference here. Now, obviously, economics and politics are closely related in some sense. But our political system in our country, our republic, based on a Congress, based on a Senate, the House of Representatives, executive branch being separate from Congress, the judiciary being separate from both. We have a political system in our country that appropriately supports the economic system that we know as free enterprise and kind of a larger sense as capitalism. Not to be confused, by the way, with crony capitalism or other aberrations of capitalism. But the economic system is different than the political system. And technocracy was defined originally in the 1930s as an economic system, not as a political system. These scientists and engineers that started this eschewed the political system in our country. They didn't like politicians. They felt they had no need, that they were blundering idiots trying to control and make policies for technology that they did not understand. In fact, they blamed the Great Depression on these same politicians because they felt that they had done things with technology and society that resulted in everything falling apart. That was a false read, by the way, on their part, I do believe, but nevertheless, that's the way they felt back then. And there's a general feeling of that today, that the political structure of this country is immaterial, the Congress is irrelevant, and that the scientists and engineers should just simply do what's right in their own eyes to manage and control society at large. And it's also important to remember that when we talk about the economic system versus political system, that technocracy is a global movement today. It's not just centered in America. We have a particular political system in our country, but other countries don't have our system. For instance, China still has the vestiges of a communist dictatorship, a totalitarian dictatorship in its country. And yet, China is now being classified by many writers as a pure technocracy. They're going in that direction of an economic system based on the original technocracy that we find in the 1930s, the economic system. In fact, technocracy as a historical system works better in a totalitarian system, form of government, than it would in a democratic or Republican form of government that we have here in America. So looking at it as an economic system, it's covering the globe with a common interest, and yet there are many different political systems and systems of governance throughout the world that aren't the same. It's not the same as ours. Europe is different, Russia is different, China is different. The countries in South America and Africa and so on have quite varied forms of governance of the people. It's an economic coup that's taking place in the world today, an economic transformation. And the people that are bringing this to us want to control society, if you will, as a factory, kind of like a factory or a machine floor where you have a factory making something, and the engineers have designed the factory, and they're going to manage every little part of the factory from their perspective as a scientific project. Crazy as it sounds, it's social engineering on steroids.
It sounds like Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
Well, somewhat. There's been lots of descriptions of utopia over the last, I'll say, 100 years, and they all fit to some extent. Technocracy, as originally described in the 1930s, truly was a utopian system of operation. We have an example in literature of the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Huxley's book, scary as it was, science fiction knowledge that proposed or that described a scientific dictatorship where every little facet of life was managed down to the last little detail. And what people don't appreciate is that book was written in 1932. The only thing on the world stage at that point that even remotely fit that book was technocracy, and he was looking into the face of technocracy when he wrote the book. He got his inspiration from it. That doesn't mean it's going to turn out exactly that way, but you hear today in the media, and you hear people talking about it just in passing. Oh, it's a brave new world we live in these days. Well, they don't realize how true that is. The brave new world that they're talking about was looking straight into the face of technocracy in the 1930s. And those ideas have stuck, and they're striking a chord with people today. They're not sure why, but those that have read the book say, oh man, it sure looks like Brave New World to me.
Well, Huxley, if you go forward with his brother Julian, you've got UNESCO and the Humanist Manifesto. He was co-author of that, I thought, in 1933. The United Nations. So that's eugenics, that's British eugenics going forward. And if you went backwards in his history, you've got T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. So around technocracy, you've got this whole idea of eugenics, you've got Fabian socialists. There's a lot of common threads running through there. And I can't help but notice the parallels between 1932, Brave New World, and a 1919 novel from a guy named Yevgeny Zamyatin in Russia. So there was other parts of the world that were kind of also describing how there's a certain group of scientists who are seeking to control population, and different artists were writing that. Now, I think Brave New World was definitely written from a position of, this is a foreshadowing of what they wanted to do. And Aldous Huxley was the teacher of not H.G. Wells. He was tutor of Aldous Huxley. Huxley's student was Orwell. So there's also an ominous chain of continuity between Darwin, the Huxleys, H.G. Wells, George Orwell, and all these caricatures, if you will, of tyranny that got brought about into his formalized course. How would you define technocracy?
Well, as a replacement economic system, the differentiator was that they wanted to do away with price-based economics altogether, and that means capitalism. They wanted to destroy capitalism. Well, actually, they didn't want to destroy it. They just believed it was already dead. The Great Depression was a very dark time. Unemployment was through the roof, food lines, extending around blocks. Finding a job was just next to impossible. A lot of hunger, a lot of just hard times. And so a lot of people really believed capitalism was dead. And the thing that differentiated technocracy from anything else was that the scientists and engineers believed that the perfect economy would be based on energy rather than on money and supply and demand. This is a very difficult concept for people in America, or probably anywhere, to get their head around, because when you talk about doing it with money and pricing everything in energy, it just doesn't make sense. It goes snap. But here's just an example of how it might work. They would forecast. They intended to forecast the amount of energy that was going to be produced in any given period, like say a month. They would forecast the energy to be produced in that given month in the economic system that was being looked at. They would divide that energy by the number of people, and they would devise a system of energy currency, energy credits that would be passed out, kind of like food stamps, to everybody in society. And you'd have those energy credits to spend during the following month. At the end of the month, your energy credits would expire if you had not spent them, so it's, spend them or lose them. And you'd have to wait for a new allocation for the following month, again based on another forecast of the energy that's going to be produced in that period. Then on the other hand, how would you buy goods and services? Well, you go down to let's say go down to a clothing store to buy a shirt. The technocrats, the science and engineers, believed that they would be able to price that shirt in terms of the energy that it took to make it. So you have cotton grown in Egypt, you have diesel goes into a tractor, you have the cotton gin comes along and has to spin it into thread, and then it goes to a garment maker in Sri Lanka, another ship involved, and eventually it ends up in your store, wherever your town is, in a department store, and you go in and buy the shirt. Theoretically, there's you could add up all the energy it took to make that shirt. That's what you'd pay. And wouldn't be based on supply and demand at all. It'd just be based on the amount of energy it took to make that shirt. So this is completely otherworldly to our system that we understand as free enterprise, supply and demand, and so on. And it also requires a management of the economy that we do not appreciate today at all. We don't have anything like this in today's economic world. Now, there have been attempts to manage capitalism in different ways, by the way. I'll say that the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance, when communism really got underway as a social experiment, the government attempted to manage the capitalistic system. Same thing happened with fascism. Well, the corporate world merged with the government, and they tried to manage the economy. But in both cases, it was still a price-based economy. It was still supply and demand, even though the government said, we'll manage the economy. We'll tell you how much supply there's going to be. We'll tell you how much demand there can be. And when technocracy came along, the whole concept of all of those things were out the door. It was an altogether different ballgame. In fact, if you were to meet a card-carrying technocrat in the 1930s and call him a communist, you're liable to get into a fist fight with them because they hated communism. They thought that communism was a complete sellout. It was just another iteration of capitalism, and people trying to manage and manipulate capitalism to control the people. Technocracy, they thought, would do away with that altogether.
What was the technocracy study course at King's College, New York?
The technocracy study course became the technocrats' Bible, if you will, for how they intended to transform the world into a technocracy economic system. It was written primarily by a young geophysicist by the name of M. King Hubbard. The other co-founder of Technocracy Incorporated was a guy by the name of Howard Scott. And I might add that even though Technocracy Incorporated was started in 1934, the movement towards that end had covered at least the 20 years prior. There was lots of discussion that went on, lots of little groups that met. Technocracy as an ideology really got its kickstart when they became associated with Columbia University in 1932 and early 1933. And several of the prominent engineers and scientists at Columbia were actually part of technocracy at that point. Only until Howard Scott was exposed as being somewhat of a fraud did Columbia University drop kick them literally right out of the university. They said, get out, don't come back. And so there was a little time of turmoil there. Both Howard Scott and M. King Hubbard, they happened to be roommates at the time because Scott was broke. They got together the next year and they started this organization called Tecnocracy Incorporated. It was a membership organization. They incorporated in New York. Both their signatures were on the incorporation papers. And then they proceeded to spread the gospel, if you will, of technocracy far and wide. In order to do that, they knew that they had to document their economic system. They did so through the Tecnocracy Study Course. It was a 8.5 by 11 type booklet meant to be a workbook for people to use in study groups around the country, and they did. But they went to great lengths to describe exactly how technocracy would work. And that book is still around even today. You can find it, scanned copies of it on the internet, and you can also buy it still being produced by, in fact, Tecnocracy Incorporated is still alive, is still incorporated today. Their headquarters happens to be up in the very, very northern part of Washington State, close to the Canadian border. I visited there and got some information from them, actually. So the organization is still around. The book is still around, Tecnocracy Study Course. And as I said, there's also a scanned version out there on the internet that people can get and read if they're curious.
In what ways, if there are any ways, does the Tecnocracy Study Course relate to today's mass surveillance culture?
Absolutely. The specifications of technocracy included control over energy, much like we have smart grid today, with the smart meters that are going on the sides of homes and businesses all over America, and indeed all over the world. You have the Total Awareness Society today, with all of the breakdown in personal privacy and the roll-up of consumer data, if you will, into massive databases like are being collected by the NSA and others. And we see all of the genesis of these ideas back in the original technocracy documents. The problem is they did not have the technology at the time to do what they wanted to do, and I think they knew that. It was just an idea, the idea of utopia, that they felt that technology eventually would bail them out. It didn't happen maybe quite as fast as they thought, but here we are today, and we see these things being implemented today almost in lockstep with the original document. We also had evidence to support the fact that technocracy, when it was housed at Columbia University for a short period of time, shared the basement in Hamilton Hall. There was only one hall back then at Columbia. It was called Hamilton Hall. But it had a full footprint basement to the building. And they used that for temporary projects to loan to people, if you will, that wanted to do something to come in. And so they gave technocracy part of that basement space to operate for a time. The other side of that space was occupied by IBM, the early vestiges of IBM. Ostensibly, that's where they built one of their very first tabulators. And so there was an interaction between people like M. King Hubbard, who was a geophysicist, trained, educated geophysicist, and the computer science guys that were developing this tabulator. And so I expect there were some futuristic discussions between those people, like, well, where is computing going? What can we do with it? And when the rise of Nazi Germany, National Socialism began to take place in Europe, IBM was one of the very first vendors that went to the German government and sold, or leased, actually, they never sold anything, they leased many of their tabulators to the German government for the sake of doing statistical analysis and things like that, scheduling trains and other nefarious things. And it wasn't by a surprise either that technocracy also jumped the Atlantic Ocean and showed up in Nazi Germany as well. Not necessarily hand in hand with IBM, but they had some of the shared blood and ideas, if you will, I think, by the time they actually just got out of Columbia University and went beyond it. There's very little evidence at this point, unfortunately, of those early days of IBM at Columbia University, even though we know they were there. The archives of the historical archives have been removed from the Columbia library system, so nobody knows where they are at this point.
Well, what I'm hearing is that there's an organization that has jumped national boundaries, that was interested in at least analyzing the human resources, natural resources on the planet, and they had aims that they couldn't really do through technology yet. And now that when you were talking about that, it reminds me of a book that Brzezinski wrote, USA and USSR, and it was comparing the two cultures. And in there, he was talking about his experience studying East Germany. And he said they were able to collect massive amounts of information on people, which is cybernetics, but they weren't able to put it into use because they lacked the technical power then. He was predicting then in I think this book was 72 maybe, that this is what they needed to do to go forward. So a lot of the tenets that I see in Brzezinski's work are also found in the Tecnocracia study course, and Brzezinski went to Columbia. And there's also this undertone of not only sharing that information, the technocracy vibe with the Germans, the Nazis, but there's also the eugenics record office that was inspiring some of the talks that Hitler gave. So there's also this, people who seek to control other people, there's a lot of various means that are used to do that. But it seems like technocracy was a way to join all those ways and for people to use reason in unreasonable ways.
Yes, there was. The whole field of eugenics really got its start in earnest in California. Kind of figures, I guess. California seems to lead the way on everything. and Hitler actually modeled a lot of his eugenics program after California's eugenics program. I found no evidence, however, that the people involved in technocracy were directly involved in the eugenics movement, except just by simple overlap. It wasn't nearly as big, for instance, at Columbia University as it was in California at that time. However, time-wise, the eugenics movement overlapped technocracy perfectly. And so it's certain that some of the technocrats, at least, probably were also very heavily into the eugenics movement as well. But not as an organizational issue, they understand. They never wrote about it. For instance, Technocracy study course doesn't really address eugenics head on. But some of the people involved in it may well have written some things outside, in their own time, if you will, about the eugenics movement. But they fit quite well, hand in glove, I might add, because managing, from a scientist perspective, an engineer's perspective, managing society to them is a lot like managing a giant feedlot of cattle. Say you have 50,000 cattle and all these pens, and you have to mix food for them scientifically. You've got all the bins, and you load the food on the truck, and you take it out and deliver it just in time for breakfast and lunch and dinner and snacks in between, so they get nice and fat. And the cattle get weighed. The cattle get shot up with different drugs and antibiotics and whatever. But the whole process is to get those cattle in that feedlot to the market, ultimately to be butchered, turned into steaks and hamburger and so on. Not that they're trying to make food out of us. That's not what I'm saying. But this is the way a feedlot is managed. You have to have means of control and monitoring of that feedlot in order to be a good feedlot operator. And so it's an engineering problem. And so the engineers that looked at society and said, hey, this is just, looks just like a big old factory floor to us, or it looks like a big old feedlot or whatever, it begs to be managed. And so we'll use our scientific prowess and our scientific method to figure out ways to engineer society and make it much more efficient. You hear the word efficiency all the time in the writings. And make sure that the resources are balanced, that we don't strip the earth dry of all its natural resources. This is what we hear in sustainable development today, everywhere you turn. As you know, it's about conserving resources and so on, balancing resource usage to consumption or to manufacture. So you know, it's kind of a strange historical animal that had no institutional backing at the time, other than Columbia University. That Rockefellers didn't give money, Carnegie's didn't give money, the Mallards didn't give money. There was nobody that I saw around Technocracy originally, other than the scientists and engineers doing it, that had any money. And both the founders, Howard Scott was dead broke, and so was M. King Hubbard. Although at least Hubbard had enough money to pay for an apartment where Scott roomed for some time because he was broke. So they had no grants. You know, they were just people with radical ideas. There was lots of radical ideas floating around in the 10 through 1935. They had their piece of it. They had their little flag in the ground. And it wasn't until Brzezinski came along in 1970, writing his book, Between Two Ages, subtitled America's Role in the Technotronic Era. It wasn't until that book came out that Technocracy, if you will, was reborn, reinvigorated. I don't know how you'd call it. But the themes and the patterns in Brzezinski's book very closely mirrored early Technocracy. And I don't think it was a mistake that he was at Columbia University at that time. Not that he was indoctrinated by old scientists or something directly, but radical ideas tend to be discussed for a long period of time. And I'm sure that there were, in his stay there, I am sure that there were some interesting discussions in the cafeteria over the history of Columbia, you know, the crazy stuff that had come and gone, and you know, so people are going to be talking potentially about Technocracy and the ideas of it. Brzezinski was a political scientist. I'm sure that interested him, and the history of it was right under his nose too. So why not take a look at it? So I think a lot of those ideas were picked up by Brzezinski, and now discovering Technocracy 40 years later and looking backwards to see how they've implemented it, this is exactly what's been in their mind to do from day one when they originally called it, when the Trilateral Commission called it their new international economic order. We didn't understand what that meant at first. But that was it. This is it, Technocracy.
All these years later, is there any other legacy left behind by M. King Hubbard in the form of the greed agenda? What was his specific theory?
Yeah, Hubbard was an interesting guy. That's not to be confused in any way with L. Ron Hubbard, by the way. It's spelled differently. There's no relation. The names are completely different. Hubbard, and Hubbard.
Right.
So M. King Hubbard was a geophysicist, and he left the Technocracy Inc. movement, but never renounced Technocracy. He left it, I think, because as he went to work in the corporate world, you know, for the big oil companies and stuff, that it really didn't help his career to be part of Technocracy Inc. Incorporated. So he left the movement, but he never left the philosophy. It was Hubbard who, in 1954, created the theory or proposed the theory, what we know today as peak oil theory. It was more often called Hubbard's peak in those days. And he talked about it, wrote about it quite prolifically, and basically stated that the reserves in the world were going to max out, oil reserves are going to max out, that there's a finite limit to them, and that the consumption of energy was going to increase, and at some point those curves would cross, and then all heck would break loose because energy production would decline, energy usage would increase, and this was really kind of the first strong suggestion of what happens if there's an imbalance between consumption and production. But that is of what the Earth has to provide in any case. Hubbard didn't know it maybe at the time, but later he became one of the founders, the fathers of the faith, so to speak, of the eco movement, the whole business of conserving Earth's resources, sustainable development, those sorts of things. And almost any movements you look at that have to do with the ecology, you'll find them taking or giving credit to people like M. King Hubbard as being one of their founding, philosophy members. And so Hubbard finally passed, and his legacy lives on today.
Before Hubbard, there was a British character named Jan Smuts who wrote a book called Holism and Evolution. How would that play into today's green agenda?
Well, the concept of holism, as proposed by Smuts, was it wasn't officially incorporated as a doctrine, if you will, into early technocracy writings, but the concept had influence over, I think, almost universally over all the people that were part of technocracy. It's just that they didn't write about it and include it in the doctrine per se. But the idea of holism, as proposed by Smuts, is that each person, each entity, a societal entity, is a member of a larger societal entity as well. Like an individual is part of a family is part of a community is part of a town is part of a district, so on up the line, part of the state, states are part of nations are part of the global planet. And Smuts proposed that no matter where you were in this holonic structure, that your real responsibility was to the greater holon, the greater entity that you were part of, all the way to the planetary level. You know, that you were part of that great holon in the earth. I'd say the great holon in the sky, but the great holon in the earth, I guess. And so a person didn't find his identity and his value as a person, but only as the value would come only in his relation to the other holons above him. This is antithetic to the way we think in America, where our Declaration of Independence very clearly says that we as people have intrinsic value just because we're human, just because we're born human with unalienable rights. And that we don't have a responsibility to, quote unquote, serve the greater good. Rather, we are guaranteed things like the pursuit of life, life, liberty, and happiness, the pursuit of happiness. And so the idea of Smuts' holarchy really struck a chord with all of these progressive groups, and I think in particular probably with technocracy, because as they set up their system, it very much mimicked this holarchy system, where you had all the different components being, serving the greater components above them, until you get to in fact, even the organizational chart, that is the technocracy organizational chart of the North American continent, resembled the holon idea, where everybody down on the lower on the ladder would serve the people above. It's a dangerous concept, a dangerous philosophy. We see it all around us today in various forms. Movies have been made supporting this idea. Where'd they get the idea? I don't know if they read Smuts, but it's just everywhere. It's all around us.
Well, and some of the other ideas that had taken root in Germany, aside from technocracy, were creating one of the worst periods in 20th century history. And so it's not just, their use of technology to try to govern and control people. There's also some corrupt reasoning. There's some racist philosophy. It's like a melting pot. It's like it was somebody's experiment that they couldn't conduct in their own country. And so you had American and British, and I'm sure other countries that were contributing to the corporate infrastructure underneath of Nazi Germany, like IBM. Mm-hmm. And so is there anything else you have to offer on the Nazis' use of technocracy? Because then my next question is going to go toward technocracy and Operation Paperclip.
Right. Yeah, technocracy in Germany was interesting. The Germans they're very different than Americans. It's an understatement. But Germans have always had an idea of if it's not invented here, it doesn't exist. And when technocracy became a viable movement in Germany, there was a number of people, engineers and scientists, that adhered to technocracy. They repented. They weren't organizationally connected to the American counterpart, but they reprinted all the articles from the journals over here. They translated and reprinted them in German. So there was obviously, they were in sync with each other, even if they weren't organizationally connected. But the organization of technocracy ran afoul with Hitler when he finally realized that he just really didn't want any other organizations around that might upstage him. So he basically just outlawed the technocracy organization. I'm sure he just viewed it as competition.
Competition's a sin. But
that did not stop the technocrats from operating within Nazi Germany over the entire course of the war. This was never recognized until recently. A German historian at a German university and wrote a book. The name of the book slips me right now, but he wrote a book and suggested that these technocrats had a profound impact on Hitler's Germany. All during the bad period of time when things really got dicey, during the Holocaust, for instance, and the technocrats were not supposed to be communicating with each other. They were embedded in all the various columns of power that Hitler had established. And nobody was really supposed to communicate between those columns of power because Hitler, being paranoid that he was, wanted to keep everybody in the dark as to what the other side was doing so he could control everybody. And he wouldn't get any rebellion that way, like people want to knock him off and take over the whole structure. But what this German historian found out is these technocrats continued to work within the German government, and that they actually communicated secretly amongst themselves all during this period of time. And at the end of the war, it was also interesting. And these were the people, by the way, that made the technology for Hitler to do what he did. These are the people included, IBM and the machines they leased to, the tabulators they leased to Germany. This whole technocratic movement made possible, literally, what Hitler did. If it were not for them, he would not have succeeded. They communicated with each other during the war between columns of power. This is now a matter of history. It's been documented in Germany. And at the end of the war, you mentioned Operation Paperclip. At the end of the war, lots of interesting things happened. Most of the military people and some of the politicians went off to Nuremberg, got tried. Some of them died. Some of them got long prison terms. Many German people who were accused or would have been accused, they fled to other countries, like many in South America, Argentina, for instance. And Operation Paperclip was a top secret project back in those days. Only recently was declassified and written about extensively. There was a book actually earlier, I think it was last year, called Operation Paperclip. And what happened was that our government, under top secret operation, brought some 1,600 scientists and engineers from Germany, from Nazi Germany, back to the United States. These included the technocrats that were operating within the Nazi experience all during that period of time. They never faced Nuremberg. They never faced charges. They basically were brought over here on, to be sanitized, if you will, as far as reputation is concerned and history. And they were put into top positions in military research labs, in some universities under contract with the military, for instance. And they basically just went on with life as if nothing had happened in a different country. And this kind of brings up a principle that I see with technocrats in general. The technocrats and technocracy doesn't really care what political system it operates under. The political system is not the important thing to them. The methodology is. As long as their scientific method is being used, the political ends to which it's used really don't matter. It's just that you use the correct procedure to get there. That's why they had no problem, apparently, with the atrocious things that happened in Nazi Germany during the period of time. You say, well, do they have no conscience? Maybe some did, but a lot of them didn't. They saw no problem with aiding and abetting, the extermination of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And, we talk about, people talk about the Holocaust being about Jews, and it really was, but you know what? Hitler killed all the gypsies. He killed blacks. He killed Christians. I mean, this guy hated Jews for sure, but he was not a respecter of persons. That was the only target he had. He didn't like anybody that wasn't like him. I guess it's ironic that he wasn't even German. He was from Austria. But the Germans didn't take that into account at the time. But the German experience was really interesting with respect to technocracy, and that's one of the reasons that technocracy failed in the United States, is that people too easily associated the American technocracy movement with Nazi Germany, and they said, we don't want any part of that. In fact, in Canada, technocracy was outlawed as a subversive organization for about 2.5 years. That didn't help their reputation in America either, that Canada had outlawed them. They didn't outlaw them here in the States, but a lot of people started scratching their heads thinking, where there's smoke, there's fire. So we just, we don't want anything to do with those people.
So technocracy starts at Columbia, it jumps the ocean, it goes over to Germany, it comes back over here with Operation Paperclip, and then the CIA takes those technocrats, those Nazi technocrats, and start running MK Ultra. So I don't know how deep your research has gone into it, but there's a relationship between technocracy and MK Ultra, and what do you know?
Yeah. Well, there is, and I'm not the expert on that, by the way. I'll just say that up front. But I have friends who know a lot about it, and most of the science. Let's just talk about the science of it without putting a moral value on it. A lot of the science that came out of the atrocities in Nazi Germany, the experiments on humans, some just so gross you just don't even want to talk about them. But that created a body of science. You understand the things that they did to people in the concentration camps, with no respect to life or limb. That body of science came back to the United States when these technocrats were repatriated. This is pure speculation, but I wonder if they had a reunion party amongst technocrats in the United States and the technocratic buddies from Germany. I could picture that happening. I have no evidence that it ever happened. But they were welcomed back into the scientific community here with open arms. And all that science, all that body of science from these experiments came back into the United States. And science doesn't just go poof and dissipate. Knowledge just doesn't go poof and dissipate. They brought it back in. It was part of their experience. It was part of their life. And even though they could not conduct additional experiments in the United States necessarily like they did in Nazi Germany, at least not so blatantly, it had a profound effect on a number of programs that the United States found itself operating with. And here we go. The technocrats don't care what political system they're under, as long as they can execute their trade.
Okay, I want to jump back and get a little of the historical context on these ideas. I would go back to the idea of Plato in his book, The Republic. There's a chapter on cybernetics and the art of steering and governing people. And they didn't have really technology back then other than words. So rhetoric was the technocracy back then. If you want to comment on that, and if not, jump to the first person in history, like Saint Simon, possibly, that you see picking these ideas up and running with them.
The ancient philosophy from people like Plato, they danced around the idea of social control a lot. Whether there was a hardcore technology that they were looking at using to implement that, other than just words, probably there wasn't a lot of technology that existed back then in the modern sense. These philosophies have melded together. They've combined with other philosophers along the way and stuff to bring about the melting pot, I think, that we had in the early 1900s. I think it really found a nexus there. A lot of these trains of thought, the French philosophers, for instance, that were writing many radical things, they incorporated bits and pieces of philosophy to justify their own, manipulative positions of society and why society should be the way they say, not the way, maybe society really ought to be. So you see this there was a melting pot of various ideas in the early 20s Some of them took the form of humanism, some took the form of communism, some took the form of fascism and socialism and so on. And one of those prominent progressive thoughts in science was scientism. And scientism, as a philosophy, you can see some of like Plato's thinking in it, even though he didn't think it exactly this way. But the father of technocracy is widely reputed to be a French philosopher. No surprise, it's a French philosopher probably. He lived between 1760 and 1825. Didn't live a super long life, I guess. But he is considered to be the father of technocracy, modern technocracy. And his philosophy was this, relating to scientism. He says, and I quote, "A scientist, my dear friends, is a man who foresees. It is because science provides the means to predict that it is useful, and scientists are superior to all other men." Close quote. That's a dangerous philosophy, in my opinion. And there's multiple problems with this. Is a scientist actually able to foresee? Does he have a crystal ball? Does he really know the future? Well, if you're somebody like Al Gore, who says we're all going to die because of climate change, he's foretelling the future. You know, he's bought into this lie that somehow he can foresee the future, and he's telling us, you better do it my way or you're all going to die. The second thing is that is wrong with a statement like this. Are scientists really superior to all other men? I would say no. They put their pants on just like the rest of us, the same way. They're men. They're subject to all the frailties of man and the mistakes of man. And they should never be elevated as some special class of superior men. This was very similar, by the way, not in terms of scientists, but it's very similar to what Hitler had in mind for the Aryan race. He said the Aryan race, that is the Germanic people, the blonde, blue-eyed, strong, muscular supermen, that they were superior to all other men. You see, that's what started that whole thing, that somehow they were superior. And scientists are not superior to all other men. So scientism as a philosophy, an elite of scientists and engineers is a very dangerous philosophy because they take it upon themselves to engineer all of society with no mandate from the people they're engineering, no input from the people they're engineering either. They're just doing it because they feel that they're enlightened.
Did Saint-Simon have any influence on communism and Marx and Engels, for instance?
I'm sure that he did. But on the other hand, only in the sense of a melting pot. I don't see a lot of direct input from Saint-Simon into the writings of Karl Marx, for instance. But did it influence them to some extent? I expect it did. These were the things that were just being talked about in those days. They didn't have. If people didn't have televisions to entertain them, they didn't have, sports games to go to every day of the week. And what intellectuals would do is they would read books actually, and they would talk about those books, and they'd debate philosophies and ideas and stuff like that, and they'd come up with their own ideas out of hammering the other ones together. And I expect that Saint-Simon was an influential French philosopher even in those days, and he was regarded. His number one disciple, by the way, was Auguste Comte, and he's known as the father of sociology, for instance, even today in college. You go to any sociology department and read about the history of sociology, the first name you're going to come across is Auguste Comte. So, they were influential, for sure. But, did everybody take them in lockstep? No. But the technocrats really revered Saint-Simon. They do to this day.
Who came up with these ideas of positivism?
Well, positivism Yeah, actually, who came up with it? It was an idea that evolved from St. Simon and Auguste Comte. Comte, I think, is credited with being the guy really that kind of fleshed out the idea of positivism. And both of these guys were stuck on the idea of where does truth come from? How do we discover truth? And how can we know that truth is truth? It seems a little bit like staring at your belly button, doesn't it? In a way, it's like, well, I think, therefore I am. But they wanted to debate the issue of where truth comes from. And positivism, as it led ultimately into scientism as well, believed that truth could only be determined according to some other hard science type of either through rationalism or through science. Scientism really was kind of an extension of positivism in the sense that it excluded all other truth altogether other than science. Scientism says that only science can discover truth about man and reality, and that there is no other truth. Well, this immediately rejects the entire Judeo-Christian ethic. It completely rejects the Bible as truth. Supernatural truth has no place anywhere in either of these philosophies. And so if man cannot discover through his own rational efforts what truth is, there's no truth outside of that. If you were to suggest to your wife, well, honey, science says that there really is no basis for love. So, therefore, I guess, I guess I don't have to love you anymore. It's not going to fly. Scientism can't explain things like love and other human emotions, compassion, and caring and jealousy and stuff like that. It cannot explain it, cannot begin to explain it. So the fact is there really is truth outside of scientism, outside of positivism, but they just don't acknowledge it. They feel it's just, that's just irrational.
Well, I think they're just looking at a slice and they're saying it's irrational because every day people are learning things. There's truth continuously being revealed through the use of one's soul in observing, identifying, organizing, and communicating in this world. And then, so the trickle-down precipitation of some of these ideas, sociology, scientism, positivism, end up over in Prussia. And there's this cat named Wilhelm Wundt, who I met through Chapter 8 in Anthony Sutton's book on Skull and Bones and Education. And basically what you see is there's this Prussian scientist, pseudoscientist, and he says that human beings have no soul, and therefore they work very much like clockwork oranges, and therefore they can be manipulated. And this is where outcome-based education comes from, which comes up to today's Common Core in its role in technocracy, because it's the technology being used to kind of give everyone the same kind of homogenized educational perspective that's very limited and based on artificial scarcity. I know that's a lot of words right there, but what do you think about it?
I think it's spot on. If you remove God completely from the equation of truth, basically that leaves man to be nothing more than just a bag of atoms that have been somehow randomly put together to create a human being for some period of time until you go dust unto dust. And if you're just a bag of atoms, then your bag of atoms is no better than anybody else's. It's just something that happens. It's something that should be managed. It's not something that should just be left to itself necessarily. And this is a very strange concept to most people when they really start thinking about it, but that's what it boils down to. They look at all of humanity, the scientists do that are involved in this scientism and technocracy idea, and transhumanism as well. They look at the whole human experiment, if you will. Well, it's not an experiment, but you understand what I'm saying. If all humans are just nothing more than a bag of atoms individually, then why not manage them? They're just like the koi in the koi pond out there. They're there to be managed, and somebody should stand up and manage them for Pete's sake. They have no social qualms about doing that on that basis. And, of course, a bag of atoms has no value. That, theoretically, that would make you worth something like $32.42 for the the chemical composition of your body. Could we melt you down or whatever? But this is certainly not the value of man that we have historically, the value that was historically placed on man. And, the Bible as an instrument of truth, as a declaration of truth over the decades and centuries and millennia, has given a very high value to man as a creation of God, not as a creation of just pure chance and just random whatever, according to, Darwin's theory. But that man actually has a very high value, is created in the image of God, and so on and so on. This is totally rejected by scientism, positivism, and all the other isms as well. They're atheistic at best. They're humanistic, meaning the sum of all things is wrapped up in man.
Well, and if we all were bags of atoms, what would be the purpose or reason for life or death in the first place?
There'd be none.
And if you don't need purpose or reason or any of these things, I challenge you to just go spend a week in the wild, because you're going to need reason, you're going to need some common sense, you're going to need patience, all these things that make us human beings and make us different from the squirrels.
The great genocides of the last century have all been predicated on this very thing, that life has no value, and that they're just a bunch of, they're just excess cattle in the feedlot that, need to be killed off because they're consuming too much or whatever. And, you look at some of the big genocides that have happened, whether it be during the Bolshevik Revolution or the Holodomor or the Cambodian genocide, killed some 3 million people. You say, how can a government kill the China, same thing. How can a government kill that many people and not have any conscience about it? Yeah, I would have conscience about it, but the people that actually did the killing had no conscience about that. 2 million, 3 million, 10 million, 30 million, whatever, of your own citizens, they're just viewed as just a bucket of atoms.
Pol Pot would get rid of you and you, because you both got glasses. So Pol Pot would have gotten rid of you, right?
Yeah.
So this trend in history, it didn't happen back in the time of St. Simon or Comte or even Robert Owen, but these ideas start to build up over decades. And it's not the messengers who delivered those ideas. Those ideas are out there and they're neutral. Different generations in different parts of the world, under different circumstances, pick them up and start to use them in tools, sometimes in not so friendly ways. I wanted to touch on Robert Owen in New Harmony, Indiana, and his, do you know anything about the utopian colony there?
Say it again to me now.
Robert Owen,
yeah.
New Harmony, Indiana. He had set up, it was called, New Harmony was the place.
Right.
Utopian socialism.
Right. That commune experiment was, let's see, what was the time frame of that again? What year was that?
I thought it was in the 1860s, maybe. I wish Kevin Cole was here.
Yeah. There was a number of communes set up in Canada to experience technocracy. Some of them are still around. They don't know why they're around because they've lost their technocracy flavor. Men have attempted utopian systems for a long time, certainly more than 100 years back. None have ever worked out very well because they have a structure that forces the people to conform within the utopian system. There's no reason to believe, based on any utopian experiment, that it would work on a larger scale with any greater success. But the utopians of today, somehow still beating their heads, against that same wall. But, oh no, all we need to do to succeed is we just need to have a bigger system and more control, and somehow that's going to make the difference, and it's going to make it possible to have a good utopian system. But they've all failed. Every one of them has gone back to whatever, I don't know. They just flopped. And the ones that are up in the technocracy experiments that were up in Canada, as far as we could determine, none of them remember their technocratic roots. They're just existing. They don't know why they're there, but yeah.
Thorstein Veblen. I had become aware of him because of his writings on conspicuous consumption. And then later on, I realized that he was a writer for the Journal on Race Relations. Race Development, the Journal of Race Development. That became Council on Foreign Relations Foreign Affairs magazine. So Foreign Affairs Today came from that. Some people thought it was a eugenics journal, but really it's about international relations. But if you get to international relations, that's kind of about eugenics as well. It's the control of other people outside of yourself. And that's kind of, I would say that's a sin, to control someone other than yourself, to have a slave like that. Thorstein Veblen, what does he mean to history, and how is his work applicable through today?
Well, Veblen was one of the instrumental technocrats that founded the technocracy movement in the 20s. Were it not for Veblen, I'm not sure how the whole thing would have turned out at all, but he was really the glue that was binding the people together in the 20s. And although I believe he died prematurely before the actual birth of technocracy in 1932, 3, and 4, he was really kind of the main guy that proposed bringing all these scientists and engineers together to talk about what he called a society, or a Soviet of engineers. And it was not communism, it was not socialism.
What does Soviet
even
mean?
Though we called it Soviet. Soviet just means a method of control. In other words, using the engineering and science to control the society that is pointed towards. And so he brought together people like Howard Scott and like M. King Hubbard. That's where they, in fact, Howard Scott was the main disciple of Veblen. He was like the guy that was always there, to learn from him. And he took almost every idea that Veblen put out, and even went further in some ideas as he got started with his own independent Technocracy Incorporated movement. But if it were not for Veblen, I doubt Howard Scott would have ever got to where he got.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Same thing with M. King Hubbard.
Wow.
So he was instrumental.
Okay, so I think you're going to like this then. While Veblen's working for the Journal of Race Development, the Journal of Race Development was created in 1910 by G. Stanley Hall, who was a student of Wilhelm Wundt and also a member of Skull and Bones. I learned this all from a little tiny... See, Sutton published his Skull and Bones book in pamphlets. So when I first found this information, I'm looking in for the pamphlet. I paid $80 for 20 pages. And then I found out it's in his other book. It's like chapter 8 in the bigger Skull and Bones Secret Establishment book. G. Stanley Hall is part of the Yale Troika of people who went overseas to be trained by Wundt to come back here and change our schooling system. And so now we have an overlap between Skull and Bones, Technocracy, the Council on Foreign Relations, this idea of international relations. I think you're really onto something here. What can you say about G. Stanley Hall or the influence of Skull and Bones?
At the time, Skull and Bones was an influential organization in the sense that it brought together elite people to do, secretive / radical things in society. And back from about 1900 up to 1935, maybe even 1940, I view that as a period of radicalism, a radical thought. Not radical in the sense just left wing, but radical in the sense that, shake 'em up philosophies. Everybody wanted to have some new thing. They wanted to throw off the shackles of the old system, which is primarily based on religion and divine inspiration and so on. And they wanted to do something radically new. And I think a lot of that could be laid at the feet of Charles Darwin, for instance, who really stirred the pot with his Origin of Species and book, and got people to thinking. And then communism came along. Karl Marx proposed just some radical ideas that people were talking about, and The whole eugenics thing was floating around in those early days as well. There was a competition. I view it as a competition amongst thinkers to want to come up with the newest thing, the newest, most radical possible thing that they could think up. And I think a lot of them talked in that way, like, wow, so-and-so, Karl Marx got, he got all this stuff about, the basis for communism, but, let's do something different. Let's think up some other cockeyed philosophy and see if we can make it stick when we throw it at the wall. So, you had technocrats thinking that way in the early days, let's do something new. Let's not just take everything that's out there, but, let's invent some new thing. And, the eugenics movement was not a broad-based movement for sure, but it sure was testy. I'll say that as far as being radical, having really far out ideas and stuff. It was really off the wall even back for those days. And so do you see the overlap between people involved with technocracy, like I said earlier, and eugenics? It doesn't mean that eugenics was organically hooked to technocracy when Howard Scott and Hubbard actually formed the organization in 1934. But the influence is obviously there.
There was a 19th century author named Edward Bellamy who wrote a book called Looking Backward. How did that affect the big box store culture we see today?
It was a huge book back in those days and continued well into the last century. And the book essentially was kind of a story of Rip Van Winkle type story where a guy went to sleep or was in a coma or whatever for 100 years, and he woke up and he goes outside and goes, "Whoa, what's going on here?" And all of the, like a time traveler, and he awakes in this new utopian world, and he's looking backwards to see how things have changed since he was alive on planet Earth. And it was very much a picture of technocracy and utopian system that had evolved on Earth. And it wasn't exactly a science fiction book, but it had a wide appeal just because the way it was written. People just went nuts over it. And the book had a large influence on a number of people during the early 1900s because of that. It was visionary. It was really looking forward. That is, it was kind of progressive in its nature. And I'm sure that a lot of different groups that were talking different things, including the technocrats, had a stake in that book somewhere, in that whole idea that, hey, we're planning the future here. We're going to direct the future. We're going to be the future. And whoever gets to the future first is going to be the ones that wins the future, I guess. So, the communists, they wanted to get their future, and the technocrats wanted their future, and the fascists wanted their future, and everybody was vying for what was going to be the final, the state of the world. And this book I think had a profound effect on a number of people for different reasons. Not all the same, but I think a lot of people looked at it and said, "Wow, this is we need to think about the future." And then look at it kind of from a backwards point of view, how we're going to get there.
Well, and I think maybe one of the readers of that book was a young Herbert George Wells as he was studying under T.H. Huxley. And he's like, wait a minute, this time travel thing's interesting, because he wrote The Time Machine, and then he wrote War in the Air, which was 1907, which predicts World War I. And then he wrote a whole bunch of other stuff, New World Order, the New Machiavellis. How does he fit in? Or did his artistic stylings influence technocracy, do you think? Or how do you think that
I don't think so. I don't think so necessarily. Engineers and scientists, especially the ones that exist at Columbia University, and by the way, I'm thinking probably half of those people that I remember by name were German. They have German extraction. And they very much had an idea of not invented here syndrome. What they wanted to do, they wanted to be their particular invention. And engineers are just kind of that way in general. I really don't mean to stereotype all engineers, but for the ones that have this mindset that they're superior to all other men, if an idea didn't come from them, it basically is no good. So that's why we see somebody like Al Gore hanging on to global warming, when maybe even the evidence is it might be going the other way. In fact, they used the same technique back in the 70s when they called for global cooling. We were all going to die because the world was going into ice age. And that didn't work out too well. So we didn't go into an ice age. So they turned it around and said, well, it's global warming. We got that wrong. It's not global warming. We're all going to die because the seas are going to rise. And it's kind of a crazy.
It's a sales pitch. Al Gore's pitching you on a story so he can buy beachfront property at a low price.
Yeah,
I've seen that happen before.
Yeah.
Fabian socialism and technocracy. Is there any connection? Is there any cross-influence? Are there cross-memberships?
The difference between Fabian socialism and technocracy, again, harkens back to how the economic system works. Technocracy was not proposed as a political management or a political system or a political form of government, whereas Fabian socialism basically merged the corporate world with the governmental system, whatever that might be. Whether it was Nazi Germany or whether it was Mussolini, even the president of Columbia University had ideas on Fabian socialism and probably would have liked to have seen it in the United States. But it's still based on a price, it presumes a price-based economic system. Nevertheless, supply and demand, using a currency to exchange goods and services. You still had various limits of private and personal property involved in all those systems. Technocracy proposed to do away with the price-based system altogether. So on one hand, even though you can see some kind of structural similarities between the totalitarian system of technocracy versus the totalitarian system of fascism, they're different. And where they're different is how they, at the very bottom of the economic system, one has supply and demand capitalistic economics, and the other has no supply and demand, an energy-based or resource-based economic system. And they're otherworldly to each other. You can't describe them in the same in the same sentence because they don't fit in the same sentence. They're otherworldly concepts. I'll say, by the way, people are wondering today why the world economically is upside down. There's things happening in the world today that fit no economic model that I ever studied 45, 50 years ago in college. They just don't work anymore. Economists are scratching their head trying to write new laws and new things to explain what's going on in the world. It doesn't fit. Nobody, to my knowledge, in the economic world has considered that there are two economic systems fighting for control over the whole world right now. One is capitalism and one is technocracy. One's going to die and one's going to live. The question is, which one? Will capitalism survive, or will it be truly supplanted with technocracy? Because the two economic systems are they're not even oil and water. They're worse than that. They cannot exist. It's almost like matter and antimatter. They cannot exist in the same space. One will die and one will live.